Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, and I hope you're having a great conference. In my talk today, I want to talk about the forgotten tech history of Colorado Springs. So, in Colorado, we all know that Denver and Boulder and Fort Collins have a lot of tech, but I feel like in Colorado Springs, our rich tech history just gets forgotten. And finally, thankfully, now a lot more attention is being paid to Colorado Springs and the tech companies and other startups actually as well that are popping up in Colorado Springs, and that's really great to see. But I don't think we should forget just how rich our tech history has been, especially over the last century. So that's actually where we'll start. So we have a few stops on our tour today. The first one is, of course, Nikola Tesla's lab. Uh, you may or may not know that he actually had a lab here in Colorado Springs to do some of his experiments, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then, a company that you've probably never heard of, the Alexander Film Company, was huge in Colorado Springs for several decades. We'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll talk about this term called Silicon Mountain. Now, if you look at the Wikipedia page for Silicon Mountain, it describes it as Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins. Oh, and a little bit of Colorado Springs. But realistically, this term started in Colorado Springs. We'll talk about why that is the case and what happened to kind of turn that term from just describing Colorado Springs to describing the entire Front Range region. Now, finally, we'll talk about Seymour Cray. You've probably heard this name, though you might not remember where, but we'll talk about Seymour Cray and why he was influential in Colorado Springs. And then we'll talk about IT service management. Now, IT service management is not the most glamorous of topics, but it is something that is an important part of Colorado Springs tech history. So it's worth talking about that. So let's start out with Tesla's lab. So Tesla came to Colorado Springs in 1899 to study the conductive properties of low pressure air. Colorado Springs being a great place for that. I live at about 7,000 feet. Most of Colorado Springs is between 6,000 and 7,000 feet. Denver, being the mile-high city, is actually lower in elevation than Colorado Springs. So Colorado Springs is a great place to test the conductive properties of low-pressure air. By the time he came here, Colorado Springs was definitely a city. It was well populated, but more accessible than higher elevations up into the mountains. So Colorado Springs was absolutely a great place to do the experiments that he was doing. In Colorado Springs, he built the largest Tesla coil ever built, which was just shy of 50 feet in diameter. And this photo is actually of his lab. Now, the arcs in the photo are not part of its normal operation. They were produced as an effect for the photo by rapidly cycling the power switch. Now, this lab was down by Memorial Park, actually. Of course, it's no longer there. We'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to read this quote from Wikipedia. Now, you're normally not supposed to quote Wikipedia, but this was just so well written that it was too good to pass up. He produced artificial lightning, with discharges consisting of millions of volts and up to 135 feet long. People walking along the street observed sparks jumping between their feet and the ground. Sparks sprang from water line taps when touched. Light bulbs within 100 feet of the lab glowed even when turned off. Horses in a livery stable bolted from their stalls after receiving shocks through their metal shoes. Butterflies were electrified, swirling in circles with blue halos of St. Elmo's fire around their wings. No, Tesla only used this lab for a little bit less than a year. His final journal entry from Colorado Springs is marked at January 7th, 1900. And then the lab was torn down in 1904, and the contents sold at auction to pay debts. Apparently he didn't pay his bills while he was in Colorado Springs, The property was repossessed and the lab torn down. But this is what it looked like from the outside. So now on to the Alexander Film Company. And why have you never heard of this? Well, let's start with where it started. It was started by two brothers, Alexander brothers, in Spokane, Washington in 1919. And after a brief stop in Englewood, up by Denver, they landed in Colorado Springs in 1928. From my research, the company might still be here. I found a Gazette article from 2009 that lists a North Academy address. They were celebrating their 90th anniversary, I guess that would have been. But I can't tell anymore if they're still around. I feel like when I first found out about them, I saw that they'd been, what remained of the company had been purchased by another company. But when I was putting this talk together, I couldn't find that reference anymore. Their website, which I think was alexanderfilm.com, the website definitely has been re-registered by a completely different company. So the only remnants on the web that I could find were through archive.org, I think referenced from their Wikipedia page. So there is a Wikipedia page for Alexander Film Company, and it has a little bit of information on it. Most of the information that I'm going to share came from this Gazette article, and there's some information also in the Pikes Peak Library District's archives. So some good information there. They built the entire ads before a movie industry from absolutely nothing. So nowadays, when you go to the theater and before the movie you're there to see starts showing, there's at least half an hour, 40 minutes of ads and trivia and that sort of thing. Alexander Film Company started that industry. And as you might imagine, it's a massive industry. The potential there to show advertising before a movie is just incredible, because everybody shows up, gets their popcorn, that sort of thing, at least a few minutes before the movie starts. So rather than have people sit in a dark room or a dimly lit room, why not show them ads? Great concept, and they were able to capitalize on it for a few decades. They were able to convince theaters that there was value in showing ad reels prior to the feature presentation. And at its heyday, it housed one of the largest film studios, the largest animation studio in the world, a large advertising firm, and even an aircraft business. They got to the stage where they needed their own logistics in order to get their reels out to all the theaters across the U.S. And this campus is just north of Fillmore on North Nevada. So west of North Nevada and north of Fillmore. Back when this Gazette article was written, it talked about there being a Kmart there. That Kmart has since closed. But there are a few other buildings. I think KKTV, one of the local TV stations here, bought up their sound stages and moved in there, converted them to their TV studio. Alexander Film Company experienced wild success in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, but then crashed spectacularly in the 60s with the sudden prevalence of the TV, which the owners of the company, at that point, one of the brothers had passed, and the other one didn't fully recognize the potential of TV, thought it was just a passing fad. But unfortunately, that was kind of the big nail in the coffin of the Alexander Film Company. They did ultimately get into TV advertising, but by that point, they were too little too late. Other players had moved in and taken much of the market opportunity, and Alexander Film Company never quite recovered. And this is a picture of obviously that North Nevada campus. So now let's talk about Silicon Mountain. So where did this term come from? And if you haven't noticed by now, we're moving chronologically. So Tesla's lab was the turn of the century. Alexander Film Company, obviously the the 10s, 20s, and so on, up to the 60s, and now we're talking about the 1980s. So Silicon Mountain was a term that first was used to describe the Colorado Springs area, specifically because of Pikes Peak, right? And in contrast to Silicon Valley, the San Francisco Bay Area, between San Jose and San Francisco, and even the east side of the bay. Here in Colorado Springs, we were termed Silicon Mountain because of the semiconductor manufacturer influx. So in the 1980s, many semiconductor companies moved significant portions, or in some cases all of their operations here. This included Texas Instruments, HP, Honeywell, and even some spin-off companies of those well-known names. Some of the companies aren't around anymore, but at the time, semiconductors was huge. So a lot of people built out their operations here. In 1987, there were 9 semiconductor manufacturers here in Colorado Springs. So where are they now? Well, if you're familiar with the Citizen Service Center, you might remember when they were first building that out. That was a former Intel office, I believe. There were other, HP still has a presence here. VMware later came in. They're not semiconductor, but they have a presence here. HP will actually show up a little bit later. They play into our story in a future segment. But most of the other players either folded as semiconductors became less of a huge industry, right? Everybody kind of consolidated around Intel, ARM, those sorts of companies. So TI left. Honeywell is in defense contracting. I believe they're still here. I think they have a couple offices here, but they're primarily defense here now. They don't do much semiconductor anymore. And obviously, if you read the Wikipedia page, it refers to Denver, Boulder, and then Colorado Springs in that order. Colorado Springs is definitely more of a footnote, with most of the focus on Denver and Boulder. And that's because toward the 90s and even the early 2000s, a lot of tech companies started flocking to Denver specifically just because it was a larger city. It became more of a kind of a nice place to be for tech companies because, and even now, in 2020, there are tech companies that are going to Denver because there's a lower cost of living than the San Francisco Bay Area, but with a very a large pool of tech talent, which is kind of unfortunately overshadowing the equally large, well, maybe not equally large, but still very large pool of talent that's here in Colorado Springs. Most of it, a lot of it is in defense, which is, I think, in part why it's commonly forgotten, unfortunately. So I feel like since Silicon Mountain is really Colorado Springs, and it was that the term was coined because of Pikes Peak, it's really time for Colorado Springs to take back that name. Maybe not because of semiconductors, but because of tech, and it is happening. There are some companies here that are making big names for themselves, having national and international impact, like BombBomb, Church Community Builder, Sharewell, Clover. Even though they're based in California, they have a significant operation here, and that's just to name a few. There are several others that I didn't put on this list. You can even find lists of the top however many startups in Colorado Springs, the top however many tech companies in Colorado Springs, and even some of the defense contractors, right? We normally think of defense contractors as not really being a part of the tech industry because they're a little bit different. But there are definitely some players in the defense industry that have a significant tech presence and a significant Colorado Springs presence. So that's actually really cool to see. And one person in particular needs to be mentioned both as tech forgotten to Colorado Springs, and a man forgotten to tech, and that is none other than Seymour Cray. So Seymour Cray is most well known for the Cray line of supercomputers, which at this point have largely been supplanted by massively parallel computation. He himself was actually not really inclined to do the whole parallel computation sort of thing. His goal was to build basically single processor machines that were supercomputers. So and for a while that was very, very competitive, very powerful. But after the Cray line fell out of demand and Cray Computer Corporation filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Cray started another company called SRC Computers. SRC Computers is still around. They're down, I want to say also North Nevada, not far from the Alexander Film Company former campus, somewhere over there. They are, you can see their sign, I believe, driving down North Nevada. I think they're closer to Garden of the Gods Road. But they're still around. Although Cray died, unfortunately, as a result of a car accident on I-25 in October 1996, which was, I think, less than a year after he founded SRC. SRC continued to do what they were originally planning to do, which was build, they started getting more in the direction of parallel computation. And now they do something called reconfigurable computers, which I'm not entirely sure what it is, but from what I can tell, based on their website and based on some Wikipedia entries, it seems to be just a normal rack mount server running Fedora Linux with an extra reconfigurable module to do some additional computation. So it looks like just an additional card that fits in a slot. But other than that, it looks more or less like a machine you'd buy from any other manufacturer. I could be totally wrong on this, and I'm happy to be corrected. I'm not really in this space, so I didn't look super deeply into it, but that's what I could tell. It seems like they're targeting more military and government customers and less commercial, though again I could be wrong on that. It seems like an interesting space. It seems like they're doing some interesting stuff. You know, sticking around, staying relevant, staying afloat, but they're certainly not as well known as the Cray supercomputer was. Which brings us to the final stop on our tour, which is the IT service management industry. And now, we started in the 1900s, went through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 80s, and now this brings us to the 2000s. The ITSM industry actually has its roots back in the 80s. Back then they were still called help desks. There's actually something called the Help Desk Institute, which is an organization dedicated to helping companies do help desk stuff. I hope I'm not misrepresenting them there. And they're actually headquartered in Colorado Springs, down on North Tejon. South Tejon? The big brick building, whose name I am forgetting right now. Plaza of the Rockies. They're in Plaza of the Rockies. Yeah, so they're down there, downtown Colorado Springs, and they're out there doing stuff. But of course, they wouldn't really have much to do if there weren't companies building good ITSM tools. And there are a ton of good tools out there. And what's really strange is most of them have the roots in either San Diego or Colorado Springs. And in fact, many of them were founded or run at one point in time or had executives that went on to found other companies. It's all the same group of people in San Diego and in Colorado Springs. So in San Diego, you have Remedy, which eventually sold to BMC. It actually, at one point, was bought by Peregrine, which is another ITSM system. Peregrine sold to HP. HP comes back to haunt us again. And then ServiceNow, which was founded by Fred Luddy, former CTO of both companies, Remedy and Peregrine. also in San Diego. So San Diego is kind of the ServiceNow side of things, and I think actually still the BMC side of things, though they've been bought and sold a few times. In Colorado Springs, the ITSM side of things traces its roots back to a company called Ben Data, a company you've probably never heard of, which then became Front Range Systems. This is through a series of acquisitions and mergers. Became Front Range Systems. They're still around, at least in name. You can Google Maps them, and you can find their location on Kelly Johnson Boulevard, kind of North Academy, right where it intersects with the highway. That company became Heat again through some acquisitions and mergers, which is now Avanti, which I think they're headquartered in Utah, but the company, the building and the employees and all that is still present in Colorado Springs. Some of the people who worked at one incarnation of that company or another actually went on to found Cherwell Software, which I think I mentioned in a previous slide earlier in the talk. Cherwell was responsible for the largest investment in Colorado Springs at $172 million. This was back in 2018. So far, no one's beaten them. That's a pretty good number. That's a real success story for Colorado Springs. And then obviously I mentioned the Help Desk Institute. So that's ITSM. It's really surprising to see that. Well, it was surprising to me when I found out this. I'm not originally a Colorado Springs native, so I had to do all this research, from talking to people, from looking it up on the internet, from finding sources, to see that such a huge industry that we, again, it's kind of a forgotten industry. We assume help desks work the way they do, but we don't really think about the tools behind how they work. To see that half of the industry is rooted in Colorado Springs, and we can just ignore the San Diego half. So what does this all mean? Because I believe in my talks having some sort of practical offshoot. And history is fun. History is good to know. It's really cool to see all this cool tech history in Colorado Springs. But what does it all mean for us? What I think all this means for us is that Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins are not our competition when it comes to tech industry players. What I think it means is that really New York, which is where Tesla came from, LA, which obviously that we think of that as being the headquarters of the movie industry, Silicon Valley, right? Obviously Silicon Valley, Silicon Mountain, and San Diego in the ITSM space. I believe those cities are our competition. And obviously now we can add to the list places like Boston, Austin, other big, epicenters for tech. I think those are our competition. We may not really remember it, we may not really feel like it, but that's really where we should be, because that's where we have been on and off for the past century. We've been competitive with these metro areas, again, for the past century. And it's really within the last 20 years that we've forgotten about that. The dot-com boom and bust really did a number on Colorado Springs, and between the late 80s and the 2000, all of the semiconductor players either closing shop or pulling out. That really, that kind of did quite a number on our tech presence. But there's plenty of other tech, and we're really doing a great job in building startups. But we need to go that next step and actually get on the world stage, at least the national stage, and show that we're doing it. We're doing tech. Tech is awesome here. Tech is alive and well, and this tech resurgence has been a long time coming, and is really something to keep an eye on. So let's not forget our tech history, and let's get out there and show the world what we're capable of.